Akshay is a product development manager at AXELOS who's been focusing on bringing together agile development teams and ITSM professionals to address the new challenges popping up in the current market. Previously, Akshay's advised Fortune 100 clients on how to improve their ITSM capabilities, including heading up the global ITSM activities at Macmillan Publishing. So I will now hand you over to Akshay.
Hi everyone, thank you Claire for that introduction. For those who'd like to follow me on Twitter, where I infrequently tweet about IT service management, gardening, comic books and heavy metal, my handle is @blowboy and it'll appear on the slides as well. So let's get started without any further ado. Before we get into the crux of what I want to talk about, I'd just like to share an anecdote with you folks. Some years ago, back in my university days, many moons ago, I thought I'd hang out with a friend, and I gave him a call and I said, "Why don't you come over? Let's hang out." And he said, "Sure, I'll be over in my Rolls Royce." And when he finally showed up, he was in a rickshaw, and I said, "What the heck? I thought you said you had a Rolls Royce." And his response was, "Yes, the rickshaw has a Rolls Royce engine in it." Now, I've since learned that that's not even remotely true. But the point is that when I think about DevOps in a lot of organizations, it's very much about creating that Rolls Royce engine, but what the customer experiences is the auto rickshaw. And so there's a mismatch between what organizations are trying to do internally, faster flow, feedback, continual improvement, continuous deployment, integration, testing, and so on, and what the customer actually experiences from a service and a product perspective. So what I've been concentrating on here at AXELOS for the last 6 or 9 months is about how to bridge that gap between what teams are doing internally around DevOps or BizDevOps or BizSecDevOps, and what we could call the sort of last mile effort, which is about the customer experience and making sure the customer gets what he values. So traditionally, when we talk about DevOps, what we say is development and, sorry, my mouse button is not working too well. Or at all. Oh, there we go. Okay. What we normally talk about is development and technical ops. But there's a wider context in large enterprises, which is the service development or service design that has to happen before the technical development starts, and service operations, which starts alongside technology operations. For those of you from an ITIL background, you'll know that there's no service development. Service design in the current life cycle and service transition speak about developing the service or designing the service. We all know what service operations is. It's incident management, it's problem management, aspects of service desk, so on and so forth. So there's a wider context outside of just dev and ops, which when I talk to a number of technology teams, development teams, and CIOs, they seem to gloss over the need to manage across this end-to-end life cycle, and they focus on managing development and technology operations. So it's a bit of a back to basics for the next few slides. We typically talk about goods and services, and in a software context, they're normally treated as separate things. In non-technical situations, we tend to understand the similarities and overlaps a bit better. But when we talk about goods, generally it's a physical object. It's something tangible. It's something that can be used. Whereas a service is something that is consumed. It's something that's subscribed to. And usually there's a dividing wall between these two concepts. We either talk about goods or we talk about services. We don't talk about them in the same sentence, essentially. But what is a service? We know how to define the goods, whether they're physical or digital, but what is the service? And very simply, here's an analogy. I want to be able to get a good night's rest. And I get a good night's rest from being able to buy a proper mattress. The mattress website allows me to pay for the mattress, and it also in turn pays for all the hosting and licenses for software and so on and so forth. And the business itself manages its stock levels in its warehouse to make sure that items are not out of stock, or if they are, they're not displayed on the website and so on. Putting this into ITIL language, what I'm trying to say is I'm able to achieve an expected outcome because the website or the service is providing me with value or a benefit. The service that the business is providing me manages its costs, whether that's incoming revenue or outgoing expenditure. And the cost could also be non-financial costs, like the amount of time it takes for me to find the thing I want to buy. The business also takes care of its risks, stock outages, but also technology risks like website inavailability and so on. So let's translate this into digital goods. And I've got a few scenarios where we can look at how value changes over time. The first scenario is about acquiring digital goods. The outcome I want is I want to be able to use a calendar software to manage my schedule. A screenshot here is of Fantastical. That's not an AXELOS endorsement. It's very much a personal endorsement. I love Fantastical. The value I get out of a service that allows me to acquire this good is the ability to search for calendar applications, compare reviews, compare options, and then make a decision about which app allows me to achieve the outcomes I want. The costs of the app are clearly displayed, and costs underlying that are opaque to me. I don't have to worry about what it takes to actually develop the service that's surfacing the app to me. All I know is I just have to pay a transaction price. And the App Store, in this case Apple's App Store, takes care of all the risks around the digital goods availability or inavailability. The second scenario is about using the digital goods. Again, the outcome I want to achieve is that I'm able to manage my schedule. I'm able to manage my calendar. This is provided through the value or the benefits of the app itself. There are no additional costs because I've already bought the service, bought the product, and I've installed it on my iPad or my iPhone. There are no additional risks beyond, buying a faulty piece of software. The third scenario, again with digital goods, is value from services related to that core product. So if I have an outage, I want to be able, or a bug or a fault, I want to be able to get back to managing my calendar the way I want to. And so the value that I derive from being able to contact some sort of technical support, speak to someone, email someone, that's what's that's the benefit that I value at this point in time. The costs for me at this point are about the time taken on the phone, via email, until the service is essentially restored, or the product is restored to a working form. And the risks to this support service are, of course, around inavailability, people are off on holiday or closed for the weekend or whatever else it might be. The bottom line is what I value as a customer differs over time. There's a single outcome, the ability to manage my calendar, but this outcome has generated three different definitions of value. The value from being able to find the tool I want to use, the value from using the tool itself, and the value from having supporting services around that tool. And that it's not just support services in the traditional sense of calling a help desk to resolve a fault. It could also be being informed of an upcoming patch or an upgrade that's available and new features that are made available and so on. So once we recognize that value changes over time, we can redefine that sentence to say value is realized from both goods and services. The goods, the digital goods directly generate value when I use them, but the service generates value through when I try to access a product through the service or when I try to interact with related services like upgrades and support. And so it is my belief that we need to redefine what a product is in today's world. The product is not just the technology itself. The product is the digital goods, plus the service surrounding those digital goods themselves. And so if we accept that a product is now a function of technology and services, well, we need to extend what we call minimum viable. We traditionally associate the term minimum viable with minimum viable product, that is, the minimum set of features that a customer is willing to pay for. We also surround that minimum viable product with a minimum viable product management capability. We wouldn't want to overburden our product management and development teams with onerous processes, governance, and so on. We need to make sure we have the minimum required capability to manage the product to ensure that value is being generated. But now that we've extended our definition of a product to say a product is the technology plus services, we also need to start thinking about what is minimum viable service, and thus what is minimum viable service management. And the minimum viable service is what the customer expects once they have decided to engage with the product. So is it a comparison feature, a comparison service, sorry? Is it a support service? Is it an upgrade service? What is the minimum service that the customer expects once they've acquired the product or they're looking to acquire the product? And once we've defined that, we have to decide what is the minimum viable service management, the minimum capability required to manage that service. And ITIL practitioner talks about this for a fair bit, which is this concept of being able to iterate to the right level of service or the right level of service management. Just as we have minimum viable product and minimum viable product management, we can also iterate to the right minimum viable service and minimum viable service management. And just like with product management, it's about starting where you are and defining the vision, and then through a series of iterations, small incremental steps, we undertake a journey to get to what that vision looks like. And that vision might change over time, but that's the whole point of doing things iteratively. You are able to do the right amount of things without over-investing in any one particular direction. So at this point, it's usually useful in my presentations to talk about how we can practically apply this. And I had two slides, which I've taken one out, but I'm happy to share this with folks if you're interested. But the question I asked myself was, how can we apply minimum viable service management to a real-life situation? And I picked change management because, at least when I've talked to developers and CIOs, change management seems to come up as a bugbear more often than not. So what would minimum viable change management look like? I've assumed a greenfield environment. Obviously, in your case, you may already have a change management capability, but it's, again, about the concept of iterating in small increments and learning from success and learning from failure. But in a greenfield environment, the first thing I do with change management is to make the work transparent. And indeed, this is a theme across all minimum viable service management. The very first step is to visualize the work. No different to how Agile, DevOps, Lean, etc. talk about their management techniques. The first step is always visualize the work. But change management, once I visualize the work and I know who's doing what change, where, and when, I can then say, right, if we've got two people trying to make a change to the same thing at the same time, I can put in place guidelines to determine who gets priority. Once I've provided some priority guidelines, I can then look at how many changes are going through without disrupting the service. And I can pre-approve these sorts of changes so that I don't need to get involved from a governance standpoint in calling a cab or going through additional levels of approval or so on. And once I've visualized the work, then put in place some prioritization, put in place some pre-approved change models, I can then look at making things more efficient by introducing automation. And this is the second, I think, overriding theme in minimum viable service management, which is automation comes somewhere in the middle. That's not to say that digitization comes somewhere in the middle. You could start with an Outlook calendar to make things visible. That's still digitization. it's not automation. There's no workflow in place. There's no automated emails being fired out upon triggered conditions and so on. As I mentioned, I had another slide here to demonstrate minimum viable incident management, but it roughly follows the same flow with you start off by visualizing the work, and somewhere in the middle you decide to automate the work. And I really do stress upon the learning before automating point, because too often I've been, formerly as a consultant, brought in to automate as the first step before the business has figured out how to, or the IT organization has figured out what they actually need to do. We try to shortcut this through workshops and so on, but there's nothing like learning from real life. When I was at Macmillan, which Claire mentioned before, one of the things we did around change management, for example, was we started off with an Excel spreadsheet. We then moved that to SharePoint so that we could have version control. And then we moved to a tool. In that case, it was ServiceNow, but it can be whatever tool you have. But the point is, we learned from from doing the smallest amount we needed to do, taking incremental steps. We learned first before we jumped into a tool. Because out-of-the-box automation normally lands you somewhere in the middle of your journey to your vision. And as a result, you miss all the learning opportunities, and you're forcing your organization to jump in maturity before it's ready. This is a hard lesson I learned as a consultant, and I would urge everyone to keep this in mind when they're looking at bringing in a new tool or replacing an existing tool or so on. So, moving on. DevOps and ITSM, or for that matter, ITIL. The fine print, the disclaimers. When I say ITSM, I'm going to be talking about ITIL. ITSM, service management as a concept, covers a lot of topic areas. Today, I'm going to focus on ITIL. And when I talk about DevOps for the next few slides, what I'm going to focus on is the 3 ways model proposed by Gene Kim from IT Revolution Press. The reason I like the 3 ways model is because it's simple, but it covers a lot of what needs to happen in a DevOps model for faster flow, feedback, and continual improvement. So I've chosen to overlay ITIL processes on the 3 ways to talk about how organizations should look to improve their ITIL capabilities or ITIL-based capabilities to enable faster flow, feedback, and continual improvement. The big question when we are trying to answer this point of how ITIL overlaps with DevOps is, does the product team's capability to deliver something align with the service organization's capability to manage it? So does the product team's capability to deliver new releases align with the service organization's capability to manage releases to the customer? The capability to deliver incident fixes align with the service capability to manage incidents or manage problems or manage events, whatever it might be. What we need to do in answering this question is ensure that there's an alignment between the product team's capability to deliver and the service organization's capability to manage. So, jumping in. When we talk about dev and what development teams do, from a service perspective, we need to make sure that things like testing and release management are aligned with service testing and service release management. Conversely, on the ops side, when technology ops looks at doing things like capacity management, event management, monitoring, telemetry, etc., we need to make sure that their efforts are aligned with the service organization's ability to manage these same things. Looking at the first way, which is flow from dev to ops, we have to ask ourselves whether the flow is aligned with the service organization's ability to manage changes, the ability to manage the configuration management system, or CMDB, and the ability to transfer knowledge from one team to the next, or share knowledge across several teams. There is also another way, still related to the first, which actually goes in the opposite direction, from ops to dev. One of the things that's talked about in a lot of DevOps literature is the ability for developers to be able to work in production-like systems. This would require the ability to, for example, access a service catalog, spin up development environments in an automated fashion. This is where ops as a platform or ops as a service comes into play. And so this is where we have to align this capability with service catalogs, request catalogs, request management, which is a part of service operations. Right, looking at the second way and feedback, we need to ask ourselves whether the things like telemetry, monitoring, event management, incident management is aligned with service incidents, service events, and so on. And of course, the third way, which is about continual improvement, we have a couple of processes in ITIL that talk about continual improvement and, in general, investigating why things worked and why things didn't. Those are CSI, of course, and problem management. Problem management is not just a process or capability for investigating root cause of incidents. You can abstract it up a level further and say, why did this particular method or technique work or not work? What can we do to improve things? You can apply the same sorts of analysis methodologies outside of technology when you're talking about problem management in a wider context. Moving on, there's more, which is about aligning DevOps with service ops. And we've just talked about dev and tech ops and flow feedback, etc. But technology operations also needs to work with service operations. Service operations is where we look at things like the service desk, incident management, request management, and so on. And so technology operations needs to be aligned with it from a knowledge management perspective to make sure that they're able to send or share knowledge around updates that are being made, problems that they're seeing, and so on, so that the service desk or service operations in general is able to function more effectively and efficiently. Similarly, service operations needs to have a defined way of being able to escalate incidents and requests back to technology operations, or indeed escalate requests back to the development team, back to the product owner, for example. And again, there needs to be a focus on continuously improving the way the technology operations, or rather dev and technology operations, works with service operations. But wait, there's more. And this is about aligning service ops with quote-unquote service dev. And as I mentioned earlier, in the ITIL lifecycle, there is no lifecycle phase called service development. A combination of service design and service transition covers what I'm calling service development. And so here I'm going to focus on service design, where we typically look at things like information security, capacity management, availability management, service level management, and so on. And so the service design organization needs to be able to feed the service development package, which is essentially a list of guidelines or constraints through which, under which development teams need to work. That's the flow from service design to development. But similarly, development needs to be able to send back performance information and around that service design package so that service design can continuously improve. Technology operations need to be able to send back performance information so that service design can continuously improve. And the third way, again, there needs to be a drive to continuously improve how this information flows back and forth. So if we put all these loops together, we essentially end up building a value loop. At the end of the day, what we're trying to do is get the requirements or outcomes from the business, and we need to look at how the business is flowing information to service design, how service design is feeding back to the business, and how we can improve that flow and feedback cycles to be faster and more effective. Service design is going through its own flow, feedback, and improvement loops with development teams. Dev is doing the same with ops, technology ops. Technology ops is doing the same thing with service ops. And service ops is essentially doing the same thing with customers or users. There is information and support and help flowing from service ops to the customers and users. these customers and users are feeding back to service ops when things are going wrong, and there needs to be a drive on experimenting with better ways of enabling this flow and feedback as well. Because ultimately, what we need to be able to enable is this flow and feedback between the business and the customer. It goes round that loop, but essentially what we're trying to do is enable the business to flow value to the customer by delivering valuable outcomes to that customer. Customers are feeding back through revenue and market share, and there needs to be a drive to improve the way the business interacts with the customer to deliver the value and to get that feedback. And this is what we're calling the value loop. Now, in the context of the value loop, and this goes back to theory of constraints and lean, in the context of the value loop, focusing on just dev and ops is local optimization. And I think I've heard from a couple of people like Kevin Baer, for example, that some of the current conversation he's heard around dev and ops is making this whole topic the biggest local optimization exercise the world of software development has ever seen. What we need to do is look at the value loop, the whole chain, and make sure we're optimizing flow, feedback, and continual improvement across the whole chain. Pause now to see if there are any questions. The first one I have is technical or technology? Is there any explanation around that?
I think maybe you mentioned the word tech previously. There's no context, so I don't know if you can get someone to reply back with what exactly they meant. Not carry on.
Okay. In general, what I've said, I've used technology operations, which covers anything from database services, operational infrastructure management, and so on.
Sorry, the tech in brackets.
Brackets with tech in it. I think that was a slide at the very beginning. Let me see if I can go back to that.
Yeah, we can pick it up separately after the webinar if we're not sure. We can send an email.
Okay, but I think it was this slide that was being referred to, because I spoke about tech operations here, with the tech in brackets. I mean technology operations, which encompasses technical operations as well. So perhaps whoever asked the question, he and I can have a quick chat about this afterwards.
Yeah.
Any other questions?
We do have one more quick one before we move on. Okay. It's the service value loop. Third way can be covered by CSI in ITIL. Am I correct?
So yes, you are absolutely correct. Good question. I would actually point you to two different capabilities in the ITIL lifecycle to look at the continual improvement. The first, as the audience member pointed out, is CSI, absolutely. But I would also point to problem management. Because let's face it, what traditionally problem management has been focused on service aspects or incident trend analysis, for example, more specifically, investigating the root cause of major incidents, or discovering underlying trends, doing the root cause analysis from a technology perspective, suggesting workarounds, and so on. But let's abstract that out of technology. Problem management can be used to determine why a controlled experiment that might have changed a way of working, why did it work, why didn't it work? What can we do to amplify it if it was working? What can we do to dampen it, or what can we replace this method of working with if it didn't work? You can apply the same sort of techniques, 5 Whys, KT, so on and so forth, to really deep dive into why something might have worked or not worked. I've been in Scrum teams where the retrospective has tried to do this, albeit at a very high level, a very general level, but you can definitely apply problem management techniques to continual service improvement. Good question. Okay, that's all for now. Let's quickly wrap this up then. So before I go into the key takeaways, just a couple of points to mention. On AXELOS.com, you'll find lots of blogs, white papers. We've also got some audio interviews with folks like Kevin Bear, Barry O'Reilly, Gene Kim, where we talk about ITIL and DevOps. We talk about ITIL practitioner. ITRevolution.com, the fine folks who work with Gene, they've got their own blogs, papers, publications that also talk about IT service management. Coming soon on AXELOS.com, I'm working on a DevOps awareness product, which is a very high-level overview as to what DevOps is, first way, second way, and third way. It doesn't focus quite so much on the technology aspects, but I try to give enough coverage to technical practices, organizational, cultural practices, as well as governance and service management. And last but not least, my manager, Kaimar Karu, whom some of you might be familiar with, is working on an updated version of the ITIL and DevOps paper that was first published last year. That should be coming out next month, in the month of July. So, key takeaways. How do you say? Tweet the hashtag DevOps awareness. Thank you, Ima, for that. I forgot to mention that at the start. Right, key takeaways. The first is value has many definitions. Value is not just what the product can do for the customer. Value is also the services that surround the product, whether that's support services, whether that's acquisition services, whether that's information services. Value has many different definitions. It depends on context, it depends on time. Second key takeaway is just as we think about minimum viable product, we need to think about minimum viable service and minimum viable service management, and we can iterate to what minimum viable service management needs to look. Thirdly, be aware of the wider context. Oops, went one slide too fast. The last key takeaway is be aware of the wider context. We talked about the value loop and the fact that in the context of the value loop, DevOps optimization is a local optimization. And what we need to do is take a look at the entire system, essentially, and apply the same flow, feedback, and continual improvement techniques to optimize globally, not locally. Because at the end of the day, we want our organization to be the Rolls-Royce, not the rickshaw. And thank you for your time.
Okay, we do have one more question, actually, Akshay, if you're all right to answer it.
Yes, absolutely.
Yes, it just popped in. So the question is, businesses are wondering about translating DevOps philosophy to project ops that is outside IT, but in the rest of the company, what are your recommendations? I think
it's a great idea to extend the philosophy of DevOps to beyond development and operations. There are a couple of ways of doing this. As I mentioned earlier, I think it's time to redefine what product is. It's not just about the digital good, it's also about the service. So one of the ways of extending DevOps beyond just development and technology operations is, for example, to bring in the business into your quote-unquote DevOps team. Bring in service management, bring in service operations into your DevOps team. Orient your organization around the product. So you've got a product value stream, and everybody who's involved in the product are co-located, or as much as possible, are co-located, they're working together. You don't have functional silos where the business is sitting separately from developers, who are sitting separately from operations, technology operations, who are sitting separately from service desk and the rest of service operations. So aligning your organization along product is an excellent idea. But with that also goes aligning business supporting functions with the ability to experiment with flow feedback and so on. There's some really great concepts out of Lean that I read about specifically in Lean Enterprise but appear elsewhere. Lean Enterprise is a book by Barry O'Reilly, Jez Humble, and I forget the last name on that cover. But I've talked to Barry a few times when he's passed through London about this, and some of the things he covers are how do you do budget forecasting when you're continuously experimenting with what the customer would want. It's not possible to apply traditional budget forecasting techniques like decide what you're going to be spending on 12 months in advance when you're not quite sure what you're going to be working on in the next sprint. And so there needs to be a shift away from funding projects to funding outcomes, or even funding teams rather than funding outcomes. So there's a lot of good material out there, which I read in Lean Enterprise, but folks like Don Reinertson also talk about it in Product Factory and other books about how to orient business supporting functions to enable this sort of continual experimental software development. That is an amazing question, and I could probably spend another half an hour to an hour just talking about that. So if whoever asked that question wants to get in touch, I'd be glad to chat with them further.
Okay, great. Yeah, so if you want to send your details to speak to Akshay, then please do. Couple more questions, if that's all right. We've got time. So we have, I'm a developer at a large enterprise. How can I work better with the service management organization so we can work more effectively together? Okay,
great question. As I mentioned as part of the answer to the previous question, when in a lot of DevOps literature, there's talk about bringing operations into developer rituals, make operations part of the stand-up, make them part of the retrospectives, make them part of sprint planning, and so on. But I ask you, why stop with ops? Why not bring service managers into that? Bring service managers into your sprint planning, into your retrospectives, into your stand-ups. Make them part of your agile team. Extend the value chain across the enterprise, essentially. I definitely start with that. I think there's the other option of cross-training your developers and operations to be more service-oriented, which also aligns with the philosophy of DevOps, where you're essentially distributing cognitive ability and decision-making across the organization. That's another good place to start. There's a few chapters in the DevOps handbook that talk about how to bring in operations into development work. And I would encourage whoever asked that question to go back to that literature and replace the word ops with service management. And the whole thing will make sense. I promise.
Okay. One more question that's come in. Please keep them coming in. I'm a change manager, and part of my role is to manage the risk of a change. How can I balance this risk mentality against allowing developers to deploy faster?
Excellent question. I talked about this at DevOps Enterprise Summit. When was that? That was at the beginning of the month. I was facilitating what's called a Lean Coffee workshop, which was talking about culture and processes and essentially all the non-technical bits of DevOps. And the same question came up. And my response when this person asked me that is, what we talk about change management comes from a body of knowledge called IT service management. It's not IT technology management, it's IT service management. And what we're seeing is a misapplication of risks, of risk controls, which are meant to mitigate risks at a service level, coming down to trying to mitigate risks at a technology level. And the fact of the matter is that the technology risk mitigation is happening in your agile teams already. There's techniques like pair programming, peer reviews of code, continual testing, continual integration, and so on, which are flagging bad code early so that developers can fix them. What you need to be able to do in addition is to determine whether deployments have a risk of impacting the service. A lot of times I think you'll find that a lot of deployments are under the hood deployments which don't impact the service. And my recommendation would be to quickly identify as many of those as possible, or to continue to monitor for those types of change models and make them standard changes. Make them pre-approved changes that don't need any further approvals beyond what's already happened as part of the sprint. And again, the sprint would have peer reviews. There's a end of sprint demonstration to stakeholders and product owners. And if they're happy for these changes to go ahead, they're the ones essentially responsible and accountable for customer satisfaction. They've approved the change. There is no need for a CAB to be meeting weekly to approve changes that have already been approved as part of the development cycle. So these controls already exist. It's just a matter of integrating them.